or the risk of subsequent symptoms and to intervene in individuals who are in need of such intervention with dramatic results in terms of reduction of morbidity. That's what we need to aim for also with Alzheimer's disease. As we learn more about the condition's biology, we will learn how to prevent or control it, just as we have with other major chronic illnesses. Now, my point 4 here is perhaps a little bit controversial because everyone is very concerned about the failure of recognition of dementia as it exists already in the community with health professionals. I heard somewhere an average of 3.1 years of duration of dementia until it comes to the attention, for example, of health providers. Yeah, that's okay. I can see that. Yeah, thank you. Be careful. You don't want it to tip over. I'll just deal with the screen. That's fine. Thank you. This is my thesis, that a large part of the reason that there hasn't been more attention paid to date to early diagnosis is a sense of nihilism that has arisen over 20 or 25 years of repeated failures in an attempt to actually do something definitive about the condition. If you can't intervene on something, doctors and nurses who are very busy are not going to be paying their attention to the same degree to its detection. Okay? I think the day will come when we have interventions which will be essentially the statins and the antihypertensives and the colonoscopies and the, you name it, all of these various preventive interventions that are available for early detection and prevention and intervention of other chronic diseases. And at that point, I suspect that we will be screening vigorously for these conditions just as we are for the others. At least that's my hope. Number 5, we're on the verge of an explosion of knowledge here, which I think is going to lead for the first time to real hope and perhaps even real success in our ability to understand and prevent the disease. Number 6, you can prevent the dementia of Alzheimer's disease without preventing Alzheimer's disease. That's a fundamental point. It's a much more difficult task to prevent the disease altogether, but if you can take individuals who are incubating or developing the disease without having prevented the disease, simply prevent the expression of symptoms or delay them by only a few years, you end up with a massive reduction in the morbidity of dementia in the population. So it's a more modest objective, and one that I think is somewhat more readily achieved than actually preventing the disease itself. I believe that with research and resources similar to those that have been dedicated to heart disease and cancer, just as 2 examples, we can achieve a similar measure of prevention. In fact, I would say more. And the reason I would say more is that, at least at the level of the population, the typical age at onset of Alzheimer-type dementia is in the 70s, 80s, or even 90s. So people, generally speaking, are quite elderly when they develop this condition. As you know, mortality rates at this age are high. And postponing, preventing, deferring the onset of symptoms by a few years will very often eventuate in the individual passing on from some other natural cause of death without being aware that they were in fact destined in a fairly short time to develop Alzheimer's dementia. This is actually an advantage for us who are trying to prevent the disease, because delaying the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease will be a more potent method of prevention than delaying the symptoms, for example, of heart disease or cancer that have a broader age of onset characteristic. So this is what the disease looks like under the microscope. I won't bore you with this other than to point out that there are 2 key substances here in these senile plaques. Is a substance called beta amyloid, which is accumulating here in a precipitated state in the extracellular space. These are nerve cells that have accumulated neurofibrillary tangles. These are clumped up tau protein. Tau is a normal structural protein for nerve cells. It becomes chemically altered so that it also precipitates in this way within the cell. I'll talk a little bit more about tau and amyloid in just a few minutes. We don't know why it is that some people develop this disease and others don't, but we do know a lot. We do know that it's a chronic disease. We know that it, in most instances, begins somewhere in middle life and that it extends then for several decades before people become fully symptomatic. The earliest symptoms are barely noticeable. The onset is insidious. In most instances, the earliest symptoms are actually viewed as being normal for age, and it's only in retrospect, after several more years, that one can look back and recognize that these symptoms were something more grave than they might have been regarded at the time. People go through a stage of something called mild cognitive impairment. We'll talk a little bit about that. This is now a symptomatic condition that is not yet at the stage of dementia, and in many instances is a milepost on the way to the development of the dementia of Alzheimer's disease. Here is the chronic disease model of Alzheimer's, if you like, showing an extended period of development that is characterized by different kinds of chemical and cellular pathology that change over time in a sort of a rotation or an evolution, and the transitional state to dementia is here. This is mild cognitive impairment. Here is something called subjective cognitive impairment, which again we recognize. It's now being called in some circles early mild cognitive impairment. Obviously, there is a gray zone or a very poor boundary of distinction between the pre-symptomatic phase of the disease and this early symptomatic stage of the disease. But we do know, for example, that by the time people are in these yellow and orange stages, there's quite a lot of change in the brain, suggesting that already the disease process itself is at quite an advanced stage. Mild cognitive impairment means significant compromise in cognitive ability, which does lead to some difficulty in function. But these individuals do not have dementia. They can maintain independent activities. And we sometimes divide mild cognitive impairment into an amnestic or memory predominant versus non-amnestic form. Traditionally, the amnestic form has been thought to be the most typical first blush of Alzheimer's disease symptoms on the way to Alzheimer's disease dementia. It's no longer as clear as it once was that there's a strong distinction between the amnestic and non-amnestic types. The diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment is difficult to establish because of the fact that we have this ill-defined boundary, if you like, between normal aging and mild cognitive impairment. Once it's clear that we have a pathological state, the newest information now suggests that approximately, oh dear me, where are we here? Yeah, that approximately 80% of these individuals would go on to develop Alzheimer's disease dementia over the succeeding 10 years, provided that they survived that long. It's important to recognize and deal with mild cognitive impairment, but it's also important to recognize the reality that up to this point there are no proven treatments that are helpful for this condition, either for the mitigation of the symptoms, such as they are, or for preventing the progression of the condition on to the dementia of Alzheimer's disease. Just as an aside, I think that the reason that there hasn't been more effort made to help